Hi there. My name is Patrick, and I serve on the council at Redemption Church. We are a radically inclusive community of hope seeking to live Jesus-centered lives. You're about to hear a message from our Sunday gathering. Whether you find yourself on the go, have yet to find a local church community to which you can belong, or exploring or renegotiating your faith, we're glad you're here and hope this message is an encouragement to you. To get resources like this out into the world, we rely on the generosity of our community, and this includes you wherever you may find yourself. You can contribute at redemptionhou.com/give. Now, here's this week's message.
How's your mileage on You Do You? Really? We live in a world where everybody basically assumes that our narcissism knows no bounds. And as long as they can keep telling us that they've got a way to make our lives just a little bit better and hackable, then we'll just treat whatever it is they're offering like catnip, because we can't say no to a little better life. But I have to believe that for some of us today, we can hear the gospel of Jesus Christ afresh as good news. Because for once, we get somebody, a preacher like Paul, willing to take God more seriously than us, if even just for a second. And in so doing, the funny thing about it is it actually takes us more seriously. By taking God more seriously, it actually takes us more seriously, because it tells us what we already know deep down and seek to avoid at all costs. We are not God. And the gospel of Jesus Christ basically mandates that you get real about that. You don't have to pretend that you're God. You're not. I think most of you know that. And that's actually a good thing. And so many of our attempts, frankly, even our attempts at Christianity, are our best attempts to try to prove otherwise. But hear the good news. You're not God. You don't have to be God. You could actually just let God be God. God is really good at being God. And you can get back to being really good at who you actually are, which is a beloved child of God. It's who you've always been, and it's who you always need to be. And you don't actually have to try to be God, because God is God. And I think that's pretty good news. We preach Jesus Christ as Lord. As simply as I know how to say it, Jesus Christ is the good news. And anytime professional Christians like me zhuzh that up, or think that that's not strong enough, or think that we need to tack other things onto it, it's over. And we're just wrong every time. Jesus Christ alone is the good news. Here's the good news. The reason that there is something rather than nothing is simply because God's deepest desire has always been one thing: to be with us. I don't have anything more profound to tell you. There's not some greater secret behind that. It's the whole thing. The reason that there is something rather than absolutely nothing is because God desires to be with us. We don't believe that a lot of the time, and so we tell other stories instead. We think God's deepest desire is to fix us, or to use us. Lord, use me, put me to good work, make my life count for something, give me good utility. God's not trying to fix you. In love, as great as you are and super talented as you are, and you really are, I'm not trying to take it from you. I'm just saying that God's not even necessarily trying to use you. You're not God's best tool. There's a greater life for you than just being the tool that God likes to trot out from time to time. God's not trying to punish you either. God's not trying to destroy you. God's trying to enjoy being with you. And the more that I think about it, the more I'm sad to report that a lot of the time we don't want that. We don't actually just want to be with God and God to be with us. We think that that's not enough, or we think we're not enough, and so we try to warp it into something else. But here's the good news. God's deepest desire is to be with you. And God always intended to be with us in Jesus Christ. Creation was always going towards this communion goal. Yeah, death complicates that desire for God. It makes the risk of being with us a little more costly for God, and yet God comes anyway, all the way to be with us in Jesus Christ. And in this communion, even in death, God transforms death into eternal life. And I hope that you might start to believe, or at least want to believe, that the only thing that God has ever wanted out of you is simply to be with you in Jesus Christ. In 1968, Herbert McCabe wrote this: "The resurrection is not a religious event." This is a rather important point. There are some Christians who think that the resurrection of Christ simply means that although he died, he still lives on in the faith of his followers in the church. McCabe says the basic objection to this is that this is making the resurrection a religious event, one that makes a difference primarily to what happens in the church. And the problem with that is the resurrection for McCabe and for the apostles is a cosmic event. The resurrection means that Christ is present to the whole world, believers or not. The resurrection means not just that a church was founded. McCabe says it means that the whole world is different. The church exists to articulate this difference, to show the world in itself. Now look, I get it, especially in a room like this. I'm kind of the old guy, and I actually remember 9/11, okay? And that was kind of like the first big one in my own life when people started saying things like, "Oh, this changes everything." And of course it did in real ways. But lots of events since then, people come out and say, "Oh, this changes everything. This changes the world." And I don't know, I guess I kind of am, from a theological perspective, I want to say, maybe that's just the latest iteration of the world being the world. Maybe that's just kind of how it always goes. And what actually changed the world was Jesus Christ raising from the dead. That changed everything. And the church, instead of trying to think that we have to go make a difference in the world, we could actually just live in the difference that Jesus Christ has already made in the world. And if you can figure out the difference between trying to be a church that makes a difference in the world and being the church that lives in the difference that Jesus Christ has already made, you'll get it. The resurrection is not just a religious event, it's a cosmic event. And because Jesus Christ is still alive, you've got to understand that he didn't stop his ministry after his resurrection and ascension. In love, that is a bad way of reading the Acts of the Apostles. Acts opens by saying, here's everything that Jesus continued to do. And it keeps going on. It tells you little stories like, oh, Jesus goes away, and yet he doesn't stay away. He keeps coming back all throughout the book, continuing his ministry. And right now, as we speak, Jesus Christ is actively continuing his ministry. He is, at this moment, proclaiming good news. Right now, summoning and sending unqualified people. Right now, tending to the sick. Right now, he is giving rest to the weary. Right now, he is blessing the dying. Right now, he is soothing the suffering. In this moment, he is pitying the afflicted, and as we speak, he is shielding the joyous from everyone and everything that is trying to steal the last thing they've got to hold on to besides their joy. Jesus Christ is alive. He is at work. He's never stopping. This is the difference that he is making in the world, and you can live in it. Now, you might think that somebody like me would tell you something like this. Therefore, in light of the gospel, God choosing to be with us, Jesus changing the world at the resurrection, out there doing all this good work, now let's get to your to-do list. Let's get you a little purchase on your salvation. You can bring a little something to the party. I mean, it might not be like the mains, but you could bring the appetizers, right? You might expect me to say something like, your job is to hold on tight to Jesus. You better have faith, the right kind of faith, and the right amount of faith at the right time. I do think that is even still trying to tell the story the wrong way. See, too often when people come to church for help, people like me turn them back onto themselves. And we use lots of really nice theological and scriptural language to do it, but the message is simple. Okay, now you go figure that out. Good luck out there. Hope you find what you're looking for. And go find that faith now. Muster up the prayers. Hold on tight. Make it all work. Instead of telling them to cast their cares upon God, instead of telling them that only God is God, and instead of trusting that God has already given us more than enough in Jesus Christ, we take control back and say, you better make it work. How's that going for you? I just find that it doesn't actually work. Not if we're honest. And I mean, it's church, so I know that we're good at acting like it's fine a lot. But if you're honest, it doesn't really work. Not for the long haul. So, I'm inviting you to stop fretting over whether you are feeling particularly pious this morning or not. Stop worrying about whether you are religiously disgruntled, whether your life is all together or barely held together. As important as all of those are in their own way, in a blessed theological kind of way in light of the text that was read, they are at the moment beside the point, which is that Jesus Christ is Lord and you are not. You're just not God. God is. So to take Jesus Christ seriously and to take your faith seriously, I'm inviting you to start thinking about your faith as a gift that God gives you rather than your crowning achievement that you present to God and say, look what I have cooked up for you. 1 John 4:19 says it this way, we love because God first loved us. You don't have to cook up faith to get this God's attention. God has already decided to be in your business. God has already come and become human in Jesus Christ. God cannot get more involved in your life if you wanted God to. God is all in your life. You do not have to conjure the right prayers or incantations to get this God's attention. God's all in. You do not have to try to get a response out of this God. God's already in. Your faith is not going to activate something that God's being stingy on and holding back from you. God's already pushed everything in and said, I'm here. God is all in for you in Jesus Christ. God acts first. Then, because God has acted, we're now free to respond. Wouldn't it be great if you felt like you no longer had to muster up the right kind of faith to impress God? Instead, start thinking about faith as something that God gives to you as a gift. Because when your faith falters, it will, Jesus Christ shares his own faith with you. You remember the disciples begging Jesus one time. They said, Jesus, increase our faith. I mean, we can't help ourselves. More. We need more. What I've got is not enough, and he's here in the room. So, this is my shot. So, I'm just gonna, get what I can here. Lord, increase our faith. Jesus Christ did not respond with a list of requirements. What he said was, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you, right? I know we're a bunch of city slickers, but do you know how minuscule a mustard seed is? Really? Do you know? Some of you do. Some of you grew up in small communities like me. My first job was detasseling corn. I know how small a mustard seed is. Apparently, according to Jesus Christ, you don't need a whole lot of faith. Oh, all you've got is like a mustard seed that you can barely see? That's fine. That's good enough. Oh, you don't need more than that. That's plenty. See, you and I keep thinking that this is some sort of game where we have to purchase God and get on and perform for God. And so we think that's definitely not enough. All we see is scarcity. And Jesus Christ comes back to us and says, oh, that's abundant. That's plenty. You're good. It's fine. Moving on. But that's not fun to move on if all you know is how to play a religious game. And if the point of the religious game is to do the things in the right way to get God to, applaud you. So here, the reality is, I have to figure out, and you got to figure out, do we like the religious game that we play with God, or do we actually want to be with God? And they're really not the same thing. They're just not. Now, we need to complexify the story here a little bit too. What happens when your mustard seed faith, even if it's small, what do you do on the days that you can't even find it? Even the little speck. What happens when you wake up and you realize faith, which sometimes on some days or maybe some eras of your life felt like an anchor, today feels like sand slipping through your fingers? This all sounds good unless you are currently experiencing what some call the dark night of the soul. This vocabulary comes from a 16th century poem. And I think today we would describe what St. John of the Cross speaks of as a crisis of faith. I wonder if you've ever felt like you've had a crisis of faith. Felt like everything that was perfectly constructed for you started to crumble. It can seem really scary. It's not a pleasant experience. And maybe you're on the other side of it, or maybe you're right in it. And wherever you are, if you ever have this experience, I know it doesn't feel good. I love what Rowan Williams writes about this experience. He says, so do you want spirituality? Do you want mystical experience? You want inner peace? Or do you want God? If you want God, then you must be prepared to let go of absolutely all substitute satisfactions, both intellectual and emotional. You must recognize that God is so unlike whatever can be thought or pictured that when you have got beyond the stage of self-indulgent religiosity, there will be nothing that you can securely know or feel. You face a blank. And any attempt to avoid that or shy away from it is a return to playing comfortable religious games. Williams goes on and he says, the dark night of the soul is God's attack on religion. If you genuinely desire union, he writes, with the unspeakable love of God, then you must be prepared to have your own religious world shattered. And if you think that devotional practices, theological insights, even charitable actions give you some sort of purchase on God, you are still playing games. On the other hand, he writes, if you can face and accept and even rejoice in the experience of darkness, if you accept that God is more than an idea which keeps your religion or your philosophy or your politics tidy, then you might find a way back to an engagement that is more creative because you are more aware of the oddity and the uncontrollable quality of the truth at the heart of all things. God is God and you are not. Faith is always God's gift to us, my dear sisters, brothers, and siblings. It is not our way to gain control of God. Believe me, I know. What better way to keep God at bay than to keep a strict regimen that says, I did my quiet time. I don't have time to be bothered by a living God. I did my quiet time and I said my prayers and I read my scriptures. Done. That's how you keep God at bay. That's how you keep a living God at bay. Problem is, you start reading the scriptures and the living God keeps coming to people who had very good lives until God messed with them. I don't know of almost anyone in the Bible who went seeking for God. But I know story after story about how God sought people. He said, whatever it was that you were working on high, let's do something else. And I don't know anybody in the Bible who would have necessarily looked at the stuff that they would go on to do and be with this God. I don't think any of them would have claimed that it was like their idea of a good time. I don't think Paul was like having a great time, being laid out on the road to Damascus, right? All of the prophets of the Old Testament had very good lives that God messed with. But that's life with a living God, not a God who you control and figure out because you figured out how to work the game to your own advantage. So faith is always God's gift to us. And if it ever seems like you don't know where you've placed that gift, it doesn't have to lead you to despair. If you trust Jesus Christ, it can even lead you to doxology. Remember what Jesus says in the gospel. Faith the size of a mustard seed is more than enough. Because for Jesus Christ, it really isn't about how much faith you have. It's about who your faith is in and where you got your faith from. And if it's in Jesus Christ and you got it from Jesus Christ, then according to Jesus Christ, it's okay. And it's going to be okay, even if you can't see where it goes from you. When we forget this, we are tempted to retreat back into a not-so-specific God that we can have some sort of control over by our spiritual practices. We long for a vague God because vague gods do not make demands of us. Vague gods do not overturn our lives, and vague gods do not disrupt our assumptions. But the living God does. And the living God has never been vague. Jesus Christ is God's refusal to stay hypothetical. Jesus Christ is God's refusal to remain distant. Jesus Christ is God's refusal to be anything less than the God with us. So no, we don't preach ourselves. We lay down vague spiritualities and self-help religion. Instead, we preach Jesus Christ, crucified, as our Lord. In the midst of our desire for an ambiguous God, Paul's words thunder throughout the ages to you and me, Houston, Texas, this morning. We do not preach ourselves. We preach Jesus Christ as Lord.
Thanks for listening. I want to remind you that if there's anything we as Redemption Church can do to serve you or help you get connected to our community, we encourage you to reach out at redemptionhru.com/connect. And if you found this sermon helpful, would you take a moment to share it with a friend? We desire to be the sort of community where everyone is seen, known, and loved. Now, go out today in the love of the Father, and by His Spirit, embody the hope of Jesus to the world around you.